Welcome, everybody. This is the Reverend Thom Muller, managing editor of Our Daily Bread at spiritualquesters.org. I'm here with the Reverend Anna Woofenden, founder of the Garden Church in San Pedro, California, to talk with her about her ministry, as well as her recently published book, This is God's Table, Finding Church Beyond the Walls.
Many of the listeners tonight probably already know Anna and know of Anna. She's been a Swedenborgian minister for many years now and is one of the founders of the Garden Church in the LA area in San Pedro, California. And why don't I just let you kind of introduce yourself, Anna, and talk about some of the work that you have done, what you're doing now in college chaplaincy, and about this new book that's coming out.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. Listeners might be interested to know that Thom was part of one of the very early Garden Church gatherings before we even had picked the location, when we were meeting out on the bluffs in San Pedro. So I have fond memories of that, those early years. So part of my story is I'm the founder of the Garden Church, which is a ministry in San Pedro, that outskirts of Los Angeles. And the Garden Church, we took an empty lot and turned it into an urban farm and outdoor sanctuary. And so the book is really chronicling the story of what happens when you put a big cedar stump in the middle of an empty lot in an area of town that has need, and say, this is God's table, where all are welcome to eat and be fed. And so the book is really an outpouring of the gratitude that I have for being able to live in that story. And it's partially my story, but it's more importantly the story of a community gathering, and the people who came in and out of the gates, and the way that we were changed by God, by each other, by being in that community together.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the Garden Church is still going strong, although you are currently is that Amherst College?
That's right. Yep. So I transitioned out of the pastoral role at the Garden Church at the end of 2017, and it is being beautifully led by Reverend Jonathan Mitchell and Reverend Amanda Riley, as well as a strong group of community members and volunteers. And I am now the Protestant chaplain at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and live a couple towns over in Northampton in Western Mass.
Right on. It's interesting for me to notice that in many different ways, not only in sort of the obvious gardening way, but in many ways your ministry has already inspired folks within the denomination and outside of it. At Hillside, we're starting a gardening ministry that's very much kind of inspired by you guys. And, I've heard other folks that are really kind of rethinking what it means to do ministry and the external forms that it can take on. I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit about what it was initially that led you to this idea of the Garden Church, and to the point where you decided it was doable, and of course you succeeded at pulling it off. What was it initially that made you think about, going outside of the traditional quote unquote church setting to do your ministry?
Well, I think, as trail end of Gen X and moving into millennials, we all know this story about people are leaving church, and young people aren't going to church, and maybe people aren't even believing in God anymore. And I get that. And in fact, I don't even really, I think there are a lot of good reasons to not go to church. There's some valid reasons, and people have been hurt, and there's and for some it's irrelevant, but I have not been able to give up on the idea of church. I just think there is something incredibly powerful about loving God and loving neighbor together in community. And but I'm listening to so many people who are saying, not for me anymore, and
Right.
asking, okay, well, what is it that's not for people? And I think that the core of church remains, but we need to ask, what does it mean to be faithful in this generation? What does it mean to be church, spiritual community in this generation? And Garden Church was really an experiment of asking that question and saying, what's the context and what are the needs in this local community? And how could a group of gathered people engage and meet those needs? I'm very quick. It's touching and honoring to hear people being inspired by the work of the Garden Church, and I also always feel like it's important to say I don't think the Garden Church is like the answer to what church will be in the future. Instead, it's one example of what happens when you ask some of these questions, such as what does it mean to be faithful in this generation, such as walking the streets of one's community and saying, what are the needs? And then also, what are the assets? What are the things that are there? So I found that in San Pedro area, that were a lot of people who were physically hungry. There are people who wanted to grow their own fresh vegetables. But maybe even more importantly, there are a lot of people who didn't have many opportunities to mix cross class, which also intersects with race and ethnicity. And there was a hunger for a place for people to see each other as beloved humans together. And that hunger maybe sometimes came out in that there was less than seeing one another as beloved humans. So that was where this idea came out of how could we create a place where people could come together and interact with people that wouldn't interact with otherwise, be fed, body and mind and spirit.
One of the things I was wondering about, and you mentioned the idea that you don't feel that the Garden Church is the answer, but it's one of the possibilities. And I'm wondering if you did have an advice or an input for people who are kind of faced with that very common kind of ever-present challenge that you mentioned of folks feeling disillusioned by organized religion, sometimes even by spirituality, and finding new ways to meet people. And so I'm wondering, given that, a gardening ministry may not be the answer for every ministry, could you summarize again, kind of, you said, what happens when we ask certain questions? Um, it- what would be those questions exactly, if you had to kind of invite people into this kind of consideration of what's needed for each individual ministry? What would be those questions you would ask?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the questions is, I don't know, kind of an overarching question is that what does it mean to be faithful in our generation? And I think to drill down into that a bit more is to really ask what are the needs and then what are the assets, if you will. That might be a little too
Mentioned
technical
that, yeah.
term, but what is already there? I'm really struck by there's a Wendell Berry piece that has this line in it: "What we need is here." And I think we often can live in kind of a world of scarcity, and scarcity sometimes is there aren't enough people coming to our church, which of course leads quickly to, and there aren't enough people giving financially to our church, and there aren't enough volunteers. And um, I think one of the questions that we can ask that kind of turns things on its head, it doesn't mean that we don't need volunteers and funding and such things, but what are the needs, and then what's here? And I was teaching a seminary class last year on church planting and innovative ministry, and we actually did this exercise where we brainstormed, like I said, that everyone write down 2 or 3 needs in your community, and then write down 2 or 3 things that you have in your community. And I said, and we kind of like look, maybe it's a snowblower in someone's garage, maybe it's a commercial kitchen, maybe it's a knitting a group of people who like to knit, but like pick some of these things. I mean, it's a church band, and then we drew one of each, a need and an asset. And I said, okay, come up with a ministry. And at first they looked at me like I was just, they're like, what are you thinking? Because one that got pulled up was there was a mechanic who had a garage, and the problem was that the elementary school students in one of the neighborhoods didn't have access to breakfast or dinners. And they're like, what do these two things have to do with each other? They very quickly drilled down and were asking these questions and realizing that there was job insecurity, and some of that had to do with people not being able to get to work because their cars had broken down, and who could afford to fix your car when you're trying to decide between feeding your child and fixing your car, And it was just kind of a beautiful example of how, yes, there are very real needs.
So I'm wondering, Anna, what do you see, looking back at the ministry you did with the Garden Church and are still doing, and of course seeing how the Garden Church is still flourishing. I happen to be involved with the Pacific Coast Association of the Swedenborgian Church, so we just had one of our meetings and got some great updates on what's happening at the Garden Church, and it's just beautiful to see that it is still going strong and it is still evolving and meeting the needs of the folks in San Pedro and beyond. And it's also great to hear that you are still very much active in the ministry. And I'm wondering, do you have hopes for the future? Do you have plans for the future, not only in terms of your own ministry, but perhaps on, about the impact that your work and your approach may have on the denomination, on folks outside of the denomination? Do you see, because in a way, one of the things that you kind of partook in, were a major part of, is what I see as kind of this re-emergence of people looking at nature, looking at the environment, looking at the planet from a Swedenborgian lens, and the Devin Zuber's doing a lot of work on that, of course. A bunch of our listeners may be aware of that, and the recent work he's been doing, and kind of, in a sense, reclaiming that legacy of, engaging nature in a spiritual way from a Swedenborgian perspective. So both on that broader theme and on the theme of your own ministry and the Garden Church and its future, I'm wondering if you have any particular hopes or thoughts about how we all can kind of, be part of that effort to, again, meet people where they are, and perhaps even discover or rediscover some of the unique things that we have to offer. Wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, one of the guiding things that guided me to start imagining what could something like the Garden Church look like were these noticings that we are, and I say we very broadly, so people can take that however they'd like to take that. But I noticed that there's a disconnection from the earth for many people, and many aspects of our culture, particularly, North American um, culture. There's a disconnection from our food, that many people are not the people who are growing. We're not growing our own food. We are not, many steps removed from the food we eat. There's a disconnection from each other, that there's isolation, and there's not necessarily the strength of community that maybe there have been at times, and people are hungry for that. And there's a disconnection from God or something bigger, or than church and spiritual community. And so thinking about how can we work to create places and culture and practices that support the reconnection to the earth, the reconnection to our food, the reconnection to each other, and the reconnection to God is, the Garden Church is one example of, okay, here's a place that's wrestling with these questions and continues to. One of the things that continues to be incredibly important to me personally in my own theological path and in my work is this idea that we're all connected. Swedenborg has that great quote, much quoted quote about nothing unconnected ever occurs. And in the liturgy of the Garden Church, as we go into the prayers of the people, there's this line of recognizing our place in your interconnected web of life. We name our prayers to you. This idea that we are all connected and the choices that we make are not merely our own, that they affect other people and vice versa, and that our connection can be a reminder of how we harm others. Environmental degradation on so many fronts is a prime example of this. And it can also be a reminder of how we can be part of healing one another and healing broken systems and bringing that more heavenly way of being on earth. And so I think this is something that we all can be part of. I don't think that it's not unique to one particular ministry, and it's not even unique to spiritual community, though. I think that is a powerful place to do that work of reconnection. And those are all questions I personally continue to be interested in. As you know, as some of our listeners might not, I co-host a podcast called the Food and Faith Podcast.
Right.
One of our hopes with that podcast is to bring stories about where are the intersections of food and faith and ecology and theology, because these intersections are, I believe, really alive and crucial ones to explore, certainly in a time of climate crisis, and in a time of crisis in the church, that the church is, that I argue that the relevance of church is still a thing. It's still relevant because when we come together to love God and love neighbor, that I hope that we can be more of a force for the renewing and healing of that interconnected web rather than the degradation and harm, knowing that every action is often a little bit of both, but that we are working towards being more the the people in the communities that are bringing more justice and hope and healing and peace to our communities.
Well, thanks so much, Anna. It's really nice to hear you're still doing really well and you are continuing to rethink church and definitely continue to be an inspiration for all of us out here.
Well, it's an honor, and if this book, in my hope and in my heart, if by reading this book or encountering the Garden Church, if people can be inspired to ask them those questions in their own communities and their own lives, and are able to be encouraged to remember and engage that question of how are we being faithful in this generation, then I am grateful and happy. So people can order This Is God's Table, Finding Church Beyond the Walls, like I said, anywhere that they like. And also, are welcome to go to my website, annawoofenden.com, and there is a list under events.
Yeah, I'll make sure to include all of those links on the website.
Awesome.
And I'm sure we'll also keep people posted through ODB on your work.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you, Tom. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much, Anna.
Thanks, Tom.